With over $18 billion worth of projects currently underway or in the pipeline on the Sunshine Coast for the next 10 to 15 years, the Sunshine Coast looks super exciting. So if you're getting any feedback on this video, I apologize. There's a full-blown thunderstorm going on out the back there, which is crazy. But in today's video, I'm going to really explore 11 reasons why you should seriously consider buying a home or an investment property up here on the beautiful Sunshine Coast, which 50 days a year rains or thunderstorms and 300 days a year is sunny. You've just caught me on this particular. Let's get stuck into it. So this is the Sunshine Coast. Now, I grew up in Sydney, and like a lot of other people, I've moved north. One, for the lifestyle. Two, because my wife grew up here on the beautiful coast. And three, there's so many entrepreneurs and work opportunities up here that I didn't expect. I thought when I left Sydney, I remember my friends used to say to me, you're leaving Sydney, you're basically going up there to retire. But the Sunshine Coast is a really, really vibrant community with more projects going on than any other major regional market in Australia by far. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about, which I think is super interesting, is population growth. I'll just call that pop growth. Now, as it stands at the moment, there's 300,000 people living up here on the Sunshine Coast, and over the next 10 years that is expected to grow to 380,000 people, which is super significant. That's an average annual growth rate of well over 2.5%, which is really, really significant. And 97% of those people are expected to come from the southern states and different parts of Australia and move up here. So why that's so interesting to me personally is because that represents a 25% increase, or even close to a 30% increase in the number of people living up here over a 10-year period. Now, imagine Sydney or Melbourne was growing that fast. It would be absolutely out of control, which is why we've got so much infrastructure going in at the moment. Now, to accommodate for all of these people, and this is one of the most interesting things to me, the Sunshine Coast Council on their website has said, we're gonna need 168,000 additional houses or dwellings up here to accommodate all of this population growth. Now, we're certainly not going to build that many properties over the next 10 years on the Sunshine Coast. So it's going to mean that that marketplace, which is already extremely tight, is going to be even more undersupplied than it is right now. And 168,000 dwellings over a 10-year period is basically an infrastructure or construction boom, which is going to keep a lot of people living up here in high-paying jobs, whether they're the engineers, environmental, civil, electrical, whether they're the home builders coming in to support that growth, or whether they're people planning around that real estate, tourist-related space as well. Now, the third thing that I thought was important to mention about the Sunshine Coast is right now, the Sunshine Coast has the lowest rental vacancy rate of any marketplace in Australia. And what that actually means in Australia, so what that actually means for you is that it's already a chronic undersupply of available properties for rent, which means if you're buying the right suburb on the Sunshine Coast at the right price point, the likelihood of you getting, if you buy the right type of property, a good quality tenant is very, very high. And that means that you can sort of sleep a little bit easier from that perspective, knowing that, you know, for 48, 50 weeks of the year on average, your property is going to be filled with somebody, which is fantastic. Now, the fourth thing, and I probably should have put this one first because it's the biggest, and that is there's $18 billion, literally $18 billion worth of infrastructure projects on the go in the Sunshine Coast, either right now or projected to occur over the next 10 to 15 years. Now, I'm going to talk about some of these projects in more detail in a moment, but when you compare that to Brisbane right now, there's $12 billion worth of projects underway in Brisbane. And then you compare that to the Gold Coast, where there's somewhere between $12 and $14 billion worth of projects underway. So for such a small regional market, there is so much going on, and some of that's private, but a lot of it's state and local and national government funded in terms of these really, really big projects that will completely change the way that this place looks and feels and functions over the next 10, 15, 20 years, which that amount of money going in is really powerful for a few reasons. One, there's a labour supply or a skill shortage on the Sunshine Coast right now, which means we've got to recruit really high paying professional people from other marketplaces to come in and help us do that. And like myself, some of those people go, this is pretty nice up here. I think I'm going to stay. I think I'm going to set up my business here and I'm going to create a future for myself up here and find a way to do that. So $18 billion worth of projects, absolutely unprecedented on the Sunshine Coast before. And let's sort of talk about that. But before I do get into those $18 billion worth of projects, what I wanted to say about the Sunshine Coast, which I think is really important, is it's still affordable. Now, affordability is such a topic of conversation right now in the media. You know, Sydney and Melbourne seem to have topped out and are starting to decline a little bit at the moment, which is completely normal for this stage of the cycle for those markets. But unlike Sydney and Melbourne, the Sunshine Coast is very, very, very affordable. You can buy really, really high quality properties in great locations between that $400,000 mark. You know, and if you really want to splash out, you can get yourself a waterfront property for $1 million. You can get yourself walking distance to the beach for somewhere between 550 to 600 grand and $1 million. So for those of you with good money in those marketplaces down there in terms of equity in your homes, thinking of moving for a lifestyle change, you can really sell something down there which is just your standard suburban home and relocate to waterfront or very, very close walking distance to the beach. Alternatively, for those of you with an investment dollar where you're looking to invest in something that's walking distance, investment grade, quality stuff near the beach, then there's plenty of existing property options. Or there's also some amazing brand new estates on the Sunshine Coast as well, where you can buy really, really well priced land and get in for a great price, where a brand new home could be under $500,000 if that's something you're looking for. Or you could be in a brand new property, you know, walking distance to the beach in a brand new estate for literally under $1 million. So I like how affordable it is right now. And I think as we're already starting to see, based on the Australian Bureau of Statistics data, there's more people moving to Southeast Queensland than anywhere else in Australia right now. And so more and more of that money is beginning to come over the border, particularly as prices start to settle in those southern states. So let's talk now about some of these infrastructure projects. So I'm going to call this infrastructure, and I'm just going to list the next few things, you know, underneath this category, because there are some really, really interesting and big projects right now. So the first one is the airport upgrade. At the moment on the Sunshine Coast, we've got a domestic airport, which is great. We get a lot of tourists, or a significant amount of tourists per year. Well over 1 million people come to the Sunshine Coast each year to visit it. But what they're doing right now, and if you were to drive past the airport like I did on the weekend, you'd see that they're expanding the airport from 1 to 2 runways, with the new runway being much longer and being able to take international travellers. So we're at the moment able to fly to New Zealand from the coast, but they're going to open that right up like they did on the Gold Coast, which will have a huge effect in terms of the global audience and the national audience that we can catch from a tourist dollar perspective. So I think that's a very, very key project going on at the moment. Another one is the Maroochydore Cbd. So that's a brand new CBD that they're literally building from the ground up. Now, again, in Australia right now, this is completely unprecedented. They've basically bought back a heap of properties, bought a golf course, chipped in all of the council land in the area, and they're literally building a CBD off the ground, which will end up supporting people from a living as well as a business perspective. And they're talking about that CBD over the next 10 to 15 years, employing over 20,000 people through the local businesses that move there and that relocate there. So that's a huge opportunity, not just in this construction phase for new jobs, but as it becomes what it's meant to become, it will employ a huge amount of people and open up a whole new opportunity for business people on the Sunshine Coast as well. Now, outside of that, another project that I'm ridiculously excited about is the light rail project on the Sunshine Coast, which the Sunshine Coast Council has committed to. So, as we all know, transport options outside of Sydney and Melbourne in Australia are pretty pitiful, and there's a little bit of stuff going on in Brisbane from that perspective as well. But effectively what they want to do on the very southern end of the Sunshine Coast is a suburb called Caloundra, and they basically want to put light rail from Caloundra all the way across the beaches and past the hospital to Maroochydore. And again, that is going to be a huge project which is going to bring in heaps of talent to deliver on it, like they did in the Gold Coast, but it's also going to make commuting and accessing different areas a lot easier for people to be a part of. So really excited about that light rail project. I was listening to something from ScoMo this morning, basically, where they're looking at some stuff in relation to immigration in Australia, and effectively what they're proposing, and it seems like both sides of government have a similar sort of idea, and that is effectively saying that enough's enough with new people moving to Sydney and Melbourne in one way or another, and that 45% of the international immigrants that move to Australia will now need to choose other areas to relocate, at least for the first 5 years, or this is the proposal for the first 5 years outside of Sydney and Melbourne. So that means places like southeast Queensland that capture or will capture at least 25% of Australia's population and job growth over the next 20 years, according to the ABS, will probably take on a huge number of those people because it is the third largest job market in Australia. So what he's proposing as well, or what they're looking at, is potentially a fast rail. Now this is just a proposal at this stage which they're taking a look at, but a fast rail between the Sunshine Coast and Brisbane, which would mean, along with all the road upgrades that are going in there at the moment, moving from 2 lanes to 3 or 4 lanes into and outside of Brisbane and the Sunshine Coast, a fast rail would be amazing to help people really do what they want to do, and that is get access to higher paying jobs down there in Brisbane in a way that's not going to impact their current lifestyle too much. Now, the last thing I wanted to touch on from this perspective is just the hospital project as well as the university. So at the moment we've just had a brand new beautiful hospital built in Batinia. I think there's about 900 healthcare professionals working there. What's interesting about this hospital project is it is the largest teaching hospital for medical students in all of the Southern Hemisphere. So it's attracting the best and brightest minds out of Asia and India, and really training them up on the Sunshine Coast, which is a huge opportunity for our market to attract some quality into the region. Now, that's interesting in one way, but the Sunshine Coast University is also growing at a rapid rate at the moment. So I think we're talking about 12,000 odd students, maybe 13,000 students a year going through that uni and that campus at the moment, with projections over the next 20 years to double or even triple that. And we've all seen the benefit of the big universities, for example in Newcastle and Wollongong, and what that's done to drive talented people into a region and to keep those people in a region. The same thing is beginning to occur on the Sunshine Coast. Now, they're the infrastructure projects, I suppose, that I wanted to discuss. Underneath that now, we've really got the development projects, and there is just so much private development going on the Sunshine Coast. So they were points 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. And the 11th point in this video that I wanted to bring up is really private development. Now, we've got all of Australia's biggest home builders as well as biggest developers biting into this share of trying to create this 168,000 additional dwellings that we need right now. And some of the big projects that we have at the moment, one is on the south side of the coast and is in Caloundra. It's called Caloundra South, or Aura, and that is a Stocklands development where they're literally creating a city or a suburb from the ground up, and predicted to bring on, I think it's 20,000 odd homes or 25,000 homes over the next 30 years there. You've got a similar size project just behind Maroochydore there in a suburb called Bly, which again is a multi-billion-dollar project which will provide builders and residents on the coast with jobs for literally a lifetime right now. We've also got Bock Arena, which is another Stocklands project, Bocarina is just in between Mooloolaba and Caloundra. It's a beautiful beachside suburb where they're literally building, like they've got a greenfield estate, and from the ground up again, you're building beautiful, beautiful homes, walking distance to the beach there, which again is a capital growth option for the future, could be absolutely incredible. Then there's a huge project out there at Sippy Downs called Harmony, where they're again bringing on thousands of lots right now, giving builders a huge amount of work. You've also got greenfield sites and development going on in Peregian Springs, in Coolum, in Maroochydore as well as Batinia. So across the entire Sunshine Coast, it just feels like one big construction site at the moment with so many different options going on. And why I like all of this private development is it allows people to move into high-paying jobs. It's, you know, the labour problems that we had on the Sunshine Coast in the past. So many people are in work right now as all of this stuff is going on. So I'm excited about the Sunshine Coast in the future. I've chose to live here with my family and run my business from here, which helps people buy and build really high quality properties on the Sunshine Coast as well as in Brisbane. You know, it's a really, really interesting marketplace right now in terms of the opportunities for smart investors to really jump ahead of the curve. And one thing I like about the Sunshine Coast is, you know, there's some good areas to invest in and some areas that you probably don't want to touch, of course, like anywhere else in Australia. But there is a main road that effectively runs between Caloundra on the very southern side of the coast and Mooloolaba. And on one side of the road, there's all sorts of obviously houses and a couple of opportunities to build brand new if you wanted to there. And then on the other side of the road, there's obviously all of the other houses and stuff going on, and it kind of separates what we call beachside and non-beachside. So beachside and non-beachside, and the price difference in the past was realistically only about $50,000, maybe $60,000 difference between buying on the beach and buying on the non-beach side. Right now, that gap is probably more like $250,000 to $300,000. That's how much prices have moved. But why I'm bringing this up is, you know, both beachside and non-beachside represent really interesting long-term buying for different reasons. But if we look at the Gold Coast, where the population's a little bit larger, I think we're talking 600,000, 700,000 people. So where the Sunshine Coast will be in 20, 25 years. If we look at the same road, now this is called Nicholin Way in the Sunshine Coast, but if we look at the same road in the Gold Coast, which is called the Gold Coast Highway, which basically runs all the way from Coolangatta through to Southport, these beachside properties where, you know, 5-6 years ago, the difference between beachside on the Sunshine Coast and Gold Coast was maybe $100,000. Now properties on the beachside of the Gold Coast are selling for $400,000 to $700,000 more than what they're selling for on the beach side of the Sunshine Coast. Now, why this is important as an investor is the Gold Coast has moved forward a lot faster than the Sunshine Coast has, probably gone through a 30 to 40% gain in terms of capital growth over a really short period of time, the last 4 or 5 years, where the Sunshine Coast, because the Gold Coast has got so much attention, has lagged a little bit. Now, not everybody has $700,000 to come and play on the beach side, but a lot of investors in other marketplaces do have maybe $500,000 to come and play on non-beach side. Or, you know, maybe there's people that, like myself, see really, really good opportunity because the difference between beachside on the Gold Coast and Sunshine Coast is now so high, and the future potential of the Sunshine Coast has yet to be priced into the market. So again, these are just questions, things that I think about personally as an investor. You know, take all of this with a grain of salt. I'm just excited about the projects on the go up here. I'm excited about the population growth. I'm excited by the chronic undersupply of dwellings, because there's no way in the world that we're going to be able to create the number of dwellings, 168,000 dwellings that we need over the next 10 years. Already with the chronically undersupplied vacancy rate, that's going to put pressure on rents. It's also going to put pressure on prices. The $18 billion worth of infrastructure projects currently under the go is just crazy to me as well. It is very affordable. There's some great infrastructure projects that are publicly funded, and some really nice development projects that are privately funded right now. So, you know, why I like all of this is that you know, work, high paying jobs and population growth are huge drivers for future potential growth of any region. And then you add all of those things in at the same time, along with all of the infrastructure projects that are coming on, the extra tourists that will be coming in, as well as how beautiful it is to physically live up here if you can make it work. I'm just excited about the long-term future of the region. So if you'd like to know more about the Sunshine Coast, please jump over to www.pumpedonproperty.com and book a complimentary or free strategy session in with myself or my brother Simon, and we can learn a bit more about where you are right now and where you would like to be in the future, and talk more about the Sunshine Coast and, you know, what your options up here could look like if you're thinking about moving to live, or potentially buying a piece of land and building, or buying an existing home, which, having bought over $300 million worth of property now on the Sunshine Coast and Brisbane, we really know these markets like the back of our hand and can help you make a much, much better decision by finding the right property at the right price, or the right piece of land and the right builder at the right price. So thank you so much. Keep educating yourself. And if you haven't already done so, please subscribe to our YouTube channel below. Thank you.